Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the CyberRes webinar, Data Discovery, the Missing Ingredient of Cybersecurity and Privacy Compliance. My name is Rob Rego. I'm the Chief Security Strategist here at CyberRes, and I'll be moderating today's event. I'm very pleased to welcome some great panel experts for our discussion today. We have Phil Sewell, Eric Popio, and Louis Cisse, who are just some great experts across the globe working with many different organizations. So we'll hear a lot of great stories from them. But before we begin, I'd like to encourage you to make sure you're submitting questions and comments during the event. You can do so by using the question box below the slides, and we'll definitely have a Q&A session towards the end of today's event. We plan to address as many questions as time allots. Below the slides, you'll also see the Rate This option, where you can share your feedback. We truly aim to please and deliver the best and most relevant content. As you can imagine, that we want to continue to improve. So please ensure to use the rating and comment section so that we can actually take those comments back in and make these better in the future. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand. So let's kick things off now. Phil, I think I want to kind of start things with you and do so in regards to the topic of data security and really talk about it from the perspective of organizations and some of the requirements that you've seen organizations take specifically around data security requirements, needs, and the areas that they're trying to implement data security towards helping their organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So I think, I've been doing this for about 10 years now, working with our technologies and our customers that have various needs to protect various types of data. We started with credit card data many years ago, and that covers all types of data today. And, at one point in time, we used to come in with the latest and greatest protection technologies and assume that the customer had their house in order, so to speak. They knew what data they had and how that data was classified. I remember, one of our famous large customers in telco saying, we know exactly what those 26 attributes are. Help us protect them. So that was fine, but things have drastically changed over the last 10 years. And I think a stepping stone here is with big data. We're talking now about a situation where data was potentially safe in its source systems and source applications, but you aggregate data together and you've got a very different story. And it's not just a security story anymore. You have to involve the business users of that data, where that data is coming from, how it's going, the aspects of how it will be used and consumed by the business people using these platforms start to impact and make the picture much more complicated. So the landscape is changing, and now we get to cloud and SaaS environments, and it becomes even more complicated in terms of applying the right protection technologies for the right data. It's very hard to do that without understanding your data.
Right. Understood. I mean, I think that's a critical aspect of it. Louis, I know you've done a lot of great work with many different organizations. Can you maybe start connecting the dots on some of the potential, areas of how the technology specifics around data security really became better understood once the business outcomes that were desired by the organization were truly documented out, and now the people kind of between those teams were working with one another?
Yeah, I think one of the good examples that we have is with a telco in the UK, where and this is a really interesting one. They gather, obviously, as a telco, they pick up a hell of an amount of information from a whole bunch of customers who would basically just from the phones connecting to the cell towers, and they can very accurately geolocate a particular customer anywhere they are, and this has incredible value, but it's also incredibly radioactive from a privacy standpoint. The thing is, obviously, this data, the question that they had was that how do we derive that value and how do we make money from that value? How do we make a business case out of it? Because and I'll go into a couple examples later on, without without obviously trading the privacy rights of the customers in question, right? And so what they wanted to do was basically from this geolocation data, right, was be able to derive and understand from the statistics that they could get from all these people literally walking down the street, make a very accurate assessment of what the foot traffic is in front of a given store or in front of a given billboard. And obviously, the foot traffic in front of a given billboard or store, you can start you can start calculating and putting dollar values on the exposure that a particular advertisement has or a particular storefront has. This is a whole new world of business that telcos can come in and advise real estate companies, advertisement companies who can now have this quantitative assessment of the real exposure that they get from a brick and mortar building or a billboard in the real world. And the only way they could do that is through anonymizing the data set.
Mhm.
And the best business case that they could come up was to play around with pseudonymized data, leveraging our technology, and actually renting out access, discrete access to the companies via a subscription model, which is incredibly appealing for both parties, because it also you also get to see like the trend, and it's not a fixed picture. You actually see the full data set and see how it evolves over time, which is also incredible, because incredibly useful, because you see seasonality, you see the impact of roadworks, you see all these crazy things that you wouldn't necessarily see with a fixed data set. And this was a really big differentiator for them as a telco company, because all telco companies sell data. The thing is the fact that they could sell this live data set en masse, this big data, as Phil was talking about just now. It was incredibly valuable.
Yeah, but I think you just hit on a key point, right? So that's one of the business outcomes, which is that telco was able to really, couple of things, right? Differentiate themselves competitively from other telcos because of that, not just collecting data, right? They've all been collecting data for years, as you mentioned. It's that they're able to actually provide it in a manner where it's truly anonymized, still driving insights that the organizations that they're working with in B2B models are able to get value out of. So that's great from a competitive perspective, but it's also great from a additional line of revenue or increasing rate and growth in revenue. So perfect example. Eric, Phil, any other thoughts, examples kind of similar to that, and connecting it back to driving some different business outcomes?
Yeah, I'll jump back in here, but we've heard this story play out quite a few times. Is that customers make a massive investment in these modern, highly powerful analytic platforms, big data. It started with Hadoop and maybe even before that with Teradata and data warehousing. Now it's Snowflake, it's Redshift, it's Google BigQuery in the cloud today. And there's a huge amount of effort put into standing up these platforms. But what we hear oftentimes is that the use of those platforms is drastically limited because they're not certain of what data they can put into these platforms. So many times in my career here, working with this technology, we've kind of enabled the business to adopt these technologies, get full use out of these technologies, get more people to see the data, to monetize that data, to have more eyes on that data for a variety of reasons. But we can only do it if we understand the data that's going into these platforms and protect it appropriately. So.
Yeah, and I'll kind of key in a little bit here as well, Rob. One of the challenges I see, in addition to what Phil and had just said, is that when you look at a lot of these platforms and trying to figure out what data to put in and all those type of things, I think it's also important that as we go through the process of creating this data cloud, is that we're keeping the intrinsic value of the data as well, right? So as we're putting things in, we're not completely anonymizing it. We're not taking away some of the value of the data itself. And so it's kind of a two-edged sword. What are we going to put in it? And then how are we going to keep some of the value of that data so that by simply anonymizing it, we don't lose the fact that they walked by a particular billboard on a particular day, and keeping some of those aspects, but making sure that it's not known that Eric O'Peel himself was walking past that specific billboard. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's tying into an area I want to go to in a bit, which is basically the privacy side of it. And it also feeds into that level of trust, right? And consumer trust that's needed. But Phil, I want to come back to you for something that you brought up, which I think is also very timing, And we're seeing so much of this going on, which is around the cloud data warehouse environments, right? So we've seen a lot of these solutions you mentioned, right? Snowflake being a major player in that space, Google BigQuery, right? I mean, there's plenty of options for organizations to select from. And I think, one of the things that I found interesting, I want to get your take on this, and I'm happy to hear it from Eric and Louis as well, is sometimes I think when we see these projects going on in organizations to go to a cloud data warehouse, security isn't always at the table for the conversation, at least in the beginning, right? They may be kind of thought about as a checkbox as the negotiation is going on for actually signing up, right, if you will. And what we found is when security actually is engaged in that conversation, they're kind of finding some, let's say, holes in the models that we've seen out there, right? So I think it'd be great for you to share with everyone that's listening today just some of the perspectives of what really people need to think about to holistically ensure they're protecting the data effectively when they're going to a cloud data type of solution.
Yeah. There's a many things to talk about here. So you tell me when you've had enough. But yes, security is oftentimes a late stakeholder in that conversation.
Right.
And many times they're under very heavy pressure to get that approval, to let that project go forward. And I've seen it firsthand. Business people sometimes understand that it has to go through security's gate, so to speak. Other times, security people are scrambling to find the quickest and easiest solution.
Exactly.
And in that aspect, there's a danger of looking at all the data in the same way and saying that, I've got to encrypt everything. Well, no, you don't have to. And there's consequences of doing that. I can just turn on the encryption that's offered by the platform. Well, fine, but wait a second. That opens up many security gaps potentially if you don't know what you're doing. And of course, we all know that people make mistakes in configuring their security and authentications on these platforms as well. These data breaches are happening all the time. So going into this, there has to be a cooperation, a coordination of stakeholders in this. And you do have to understand the data to be most effective. To Eric's point, don't treat all data the same way. There is massive gains to be in tokenizing or even removing crown jewel types of data from these systems. We have ways to do that. We have ways to pseudonymize this data. And we have technologies that their deterministic nature and data-centric nature of these technologies make it possible to truly do analytics with protected data. That's a bit of a mystery, and we can talk a lot about that, and we write blogs about this, and we can demonstrate it. So let's have that conversation. But security have to be at the table early in that, rather than being just forced to make a rash decision. And then they're also making decisions that are platform specific, right? They say, we will just switch on the encryption that the cloud vendor is offering us as a lowest common denominator. And sure enough, that is going to raise many issues and eyebrows when that data moves from that platform somewhere else. And most large customers today are in a hybrid state, so they have not just one cloud provider, but many different data repositories as well. So all this points to, again, is this is not just a security matter. It's not just a CDO privacy compliance matter. It's a combined responsibility for all parties, all stakeholders to have in this. I call it a data privacy and protection center of excellence, or a program that has multiple stakeholders. They have to have that coordinated responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's the key aspect of all of this, is that every organization is just realizing how valuable data is. We hear about driving data insights, monetization of data, these different examples, the telco example, Louis. But Louis, there's another example that I know you shared with me, which I think is just an excellent example of, truly leveraging the data in an effective manner. And it's around a large retailer and kind of the loyalty program they put in. Maybe you can share with the audience. I think it's just a great example.
Yes, we've got this other customer who's a retailer, and what they do is that they encrypt all of their data with our technology as it comes in, right? And what they wanted to do is, and this is for all of their online sales as well as all of their loyalty cards for all their brick and mortar stores. And what they wanted to do was know more about their brick and mortar customers. And one of the ways to do that in order to sort of better segment that population, know a little bit more about them, right? One of the ways they wanted to go around doing it was actually gamify the experience with the with the loyal customer, right? So you basically send them out onto an app, right, where they fill in their details, and in exchange for those details and a little bit of fun, and they get some additional loyalty points. Now, what was really interesting here is that I mean, obviously the retailer could have gone and developed that themselves. It would have taken them goodness knows how many months, but it just so happens that the business team, and it, again, like Phil says, it comes back to the business. The business team had this grand idea. They saw that there was this startup working in this space. They went to the startup, and the startup was a little worried because it was the first time that they're starting to to work on these things, and they were like, "You guys are pretty big, and the liability from a this is in Europe, right? So the liability from a GDPR standpoint is a little bit out of our league because you guys are a bit big." And so the marketing people went back to the privacy team, and the privacy team were like, yeah, but if we can find a way to play for this third party to work with the encryption technology that we already use, and so bring in the security team, then we have no privacy problem. And so what in effect they did is that they created a specific service account to be able to decrypt in a particular application process the sensitive data about each loyal customer accessing the app, but they basically plugged on a third-party SaaS service onto their own loyalty system, right, with the capacity to encrypt and decrypt some of the information going back and forth, right? And the net of this is that the third party who actually developed that SaaS system never got access to the data in the clear. Like they audited things from a tech perspective. That's the retailer in question did that, and as a result, there was no shared liability from a privacy standpoint, and the retailer was in full ownership and didn't actually share the data set and didn't allow uncontrolled access to that data set. I mean, it's the retailer staff that actually input the password for the to be able to encrypt and decrypt data, and as a result, it could only happen with their validation. And this was instead of spending months developing that app, they literally had the turnaround time within just weeks. And so I think the full story is that in like 6 weeks they went from let's try to work this out to actually having questionnaires and games rolling out the doors onto people's phones and actually gathering more information about their customer base, which was smiles all around. Customers get loyalty points, discounts in store, and the retailer knows a lot more about their customers, and that startup has one big reference to go to market with. So wins all round.
Yeah, I think that's another good example, but it's, again, now the business, right, that retailer is growing their customer base because they know how to target them a little bit more based on their buying habits.
It's also derive more value from that customer base because it's about knowing the customer better, serving them better, and getting revenue from that same customer base. It's really much optimizing that revenue.
So this ties back into what I was talking about before. Like it's many different stakeholders in the business, right? So like chief marketing officer loves that story, right? Know your customer. The more we know about our customer, we can target them, right?
Time to market as well.
Absolutely.
They can react that much faster. They can, they want to think about a crazy operation that's a little bit, has never been done before.
Yeah.
They can actually go on this, execute it fast, leverage a third party that's already done some work on that. It brings that additional agility to the organization, which CEOs typically love because they have a good idea. It happens fast.
And it's a great example of also how leveraging our solutioning that married the capability of desire of what the large retailer wanted with that smaller third-party provider, and being able to actually make it work together, that they could use the gamifying application with the data being leveraged the right manner, protect the right manner, and drive the outcome that that large retailer desires. So I think that's a great example. You've sprinkled in a little bit of this before. Eric and Phil did as well. It's the privacy topic, right? And all of this kind of interconnects into the privacy aspects and the consumer side. GDPR, Louis, you made reference to. So Eric, one of the things we've been discussing and kind of focusing our attention on, obviously, has been on what have we seen on securing the data, protecting the data, outcomes. Got it. I think we're in a good spot there. Many people kind of forget about the front end of the equation that actually would make their life so much easier if they got their handle on it, which is discovery. What are your thoughts, kind of what is it you've seen with privacy initiatives and the true value of how data discovery plays a critical role for the projects that really move quicker, as opposed to just stalling out and coming back and saying we shouldn't have maybe done the security stuff and the data equation first. We should have looked at it with the actual, what do we need to go and actually identify, classify, and then protect.
Yes, I've got it.
Thanks, Rob.
Go for it, Eric.
Yeah, so, interestingly enough, I talked to a lot of senior executives out there, and excuse me, I talked to a lot of senior executives out there, and I asked them the question point blank: do you know where your sensitive data is? And they always say, of course I do. But their mind immediately goes to their core systems, their core CRM systems, their billing systems, their ERP systems. Those are the obvious places where sensitive content is. But going back to Phil's point a little earlier, when you're building these data lakes and these cloud analytic platforms, the data that goes in there isn't always fed from those 2 or 3 systems out there. So essentially, what you're trying to do then is understand what's going in there. And so when I start talking about all these fringe marketing systems like Louis was just talking about, and all these other areas out there, an organization, I talked to one of them, had 3 or 4 different email addresses from me across their systems, because I'd logged in, and then there were acquisitions and mergers and things that went on and all these type of things. All of a sudden, one organization has multiple points of information from me. Most of them they probably don't even know about, right? So the first part is knowing what you don't know and making sure that we understand what's out in the landscape beyond those core systems, so that when we load them up into these cloud analytic platforms and use the data downstream, we want to make sure that we know where it is, understand what it is, understand our risk surface that we have there, both from a data privacy regulatory demand perspective, but also from a breach risk perspective as well, as we go through and make sure that we're protecting that data all the way through. But the core of the value is you have to know where that data is. A lot of times I'll work with organizations and they'll get some kind of demand for information from somewhere, from some regulatory body, and they will absolutely scramble because they don't know where that data is. And so they have to go through a lot of internal churning, understanding, panic mode type activities to try to locate the data so that they can either produce it or understand it or present it out to the regulatory demand or audit controls that have been put in place. So again, it all goes back to, you can't manage what you don't know. So you have to have that understanding. And so, I'll stop there. I'll let the other guys go in and we can kind of go down that path, I think, a little further as well. Bill, Louis.
Yeah, and there's, it's like you mentioned, there's everybody thinks they know their core system, and then there's all the stuff, all the copies of and what comes out of those core systems that end up everywhere. But even sometimes with those core systems, and I've got an anecdote. This company's not a customer, unfortunately for us, but we had a really interesting experience in a POC with them. So what they wanted us to do is to help them with test data anonymization. So come in and basically extract data from a production system and anonymize anything sensitive out of it, so that the developers can work with that data to make that application grow and build in new features, and the testers can make sure that they work as part of the quality process. Now, as part of the POC, we were asked to make an extraction and then to run from that extraction a particular business operation that they said allegedly would work. The problem is that when we actually looked at what they were asking us to do from a SQL syntax, to be absolutely perfectly precise, and when we look at the structure of the data inside of the system that the target system that they'd asked us to extract, right, what they were asking us to do just wouldn't work. And the reality is that they'd built that query off documentation that was wrong. So in some cases, even what companies think they know isn't actually accurate. And so the project that we responded to this POC on ended up getting canned because they were like, oh, we need to do something else. We need to make sure that we get our documentation up to scratch, which was quite painful.
Yeah, and if I could redirect here just real quickly, based on what Louis said, is that, here's this just goes to show you how impactful, the data privacy regulations are coming in, Rob. When you look at something like what Louis just spoke of, test data management, that's a problem we solved in IT 20 years ago. Right? And then nobody ever heard of it again until now. All of a sudden, here in the last year, all of a sudden, test data management is in the spotlight again because of data privacy. And it's no longer just an IT-driven function. You have your legal community, your chief compliance officer, corporate counsel, chief privacy officer, CISO. I mean, everybody and their mother is involved now in these test data management problems that, again, we solved 20 years ago, but now it's in vogue again because of data privacy.
Well, you know what as well is that the cost of preparing data is massive today. I hear about it all the time, that these are very manually intensive pieces of work now to prepare data for testing groups, and especially if these groups are outsourced offshore, no one thought about this in the past, right? You're taking this data, hey, can I get a copy of this data for my testing? Sure, go ahead. Now it goes through so much rigor, and there's so much cost associated with that today. That's just, we could save a lot of money here if we approach this problem more systematically.
And there's also the evolution of applications themselves. When you think about 25 years ago, Eric, the applications used to be quite a lot more monolithic than they are today.
Oh, for
You'd
sure.
have one big system with one application with a whole thousands of tables or something, right? Whereas today we tend to think about things more in microservice-driven architectures, which means that we actually have a multiplication of different systems that are interconnected with each other with a distribution of multiple databases as opposed to one big fat one in the middle, which makes the entire exercise, when you want to actually do the functional testing, a lot more complex, when you have to make sure that your data sets are actually coherent from one system to another. So yeah, we solved this 25 years ago. Yeah, it got more complicated, and now everyone's involved. So it's a bigger party and a hell of a lot messier.
It's a lot messier, but it's also it's a great example of really the expanded attack surface because of all the microservices, all the extensions, APIs.
For sure.
One of the things that this is really driving into is kind of the crux of what we wanted to drive home in our conversation today. Is we've been doing a great job on the protection of the data. We've been seeing some great outcomes in there. Privacy has kind of come and give everyone a little bit of a kick in the pants, let's say. And I remember back in Phil, I think you were definitely involved in this, there's a very large global organization that had about 32 different business units underneath them. They were working with a very large systems integrator. And the way that they were approaching their problem was the crown jewels situation, which is we have these different sensitive sets of information. A lot of it for them was being more so around PHI data and the type of business they're in. And they said, we need to obviously get a handle on it and actually protect that data, because we're concerned about the data, but we're also concerned about the penalties and fines coming our way, right? And so working with that large systems integrator and kind of saying, this is the solution, which thankfully it was our solution on the protection side of the equation, as I said earlier. Excellent. But if you look at it, it was, I think, Phil, maybe about a year, if not 18 months later, working with them, and they're still sitting there going, yeah, we just really haven't kind of gotten things sorted out yet. Well, what's really going on there, guys? Let's dig in a little bit deeper. Yeah, well, the problem is, again, this is more of a crown jewels, and also tying it back into some different, requirements for us in PHI and things of that nature. Well, we just don't have a handle on the data that we're actually trying to figure out where it resides. Do you know what the data is? Because you have a definition of crown jewels. I thought we talked about that early on, because that's what you were protecting. Oh, yeah, we have that. Matter of fact, we've extended that a little bit more since we last talked, but we don't know how to actually determine where that exists, right? So we can go classify it if we knew where it exists. And then once we can do that, now we can actually leverage the investment we made to protect the data. And you're like, oh my gosh, guys. So kind of full circle comes back around, which is, this is the missing ingredient. It's like, how do you actually run through the process of systematically discovering that data out there? Phil, I don't know if you want to expand upon that, some other examples, maybe beyond that.
Another example is this is encouraging. I'm talking with another large customer of ours, been a customer for many years, but we're starting to get a view of this customer from the chief data officer point of view, which is great, right? We're starting to see the other stakeholders in the program, right, of privacy and protection. That's great. And this is slightly new for me personally, to ask the right questions, dive deeper into, well, they're telling me that they have very well written, documented policies around certain types of data. Great, right? But what does that actually mean? It means that they've looked at their data and made these decisions, understand what account numbers are and member numbers are and other types of PI, but they don't know where all that data is. That's a missing piece. It's a big problem, is that they kind of can't take a step back and understand that they do have this problem, and it relates to privacy and relates to security as well. So they're a little bit down the road, but they still are not equipped to catalog that data at a granular level and then determine the prioritization, the remediation efforts to hit the highest risk elements first, hit the highest risk applications first. They don't have it all together just yet. So it continues to be a struggle. Yeah.
I think I'm going to share this, guys, so I hope you don't mind, but what's interesting for the audience to be aware of is specifically with Phil and Eric. Phil mentioned this. He goes, this is a little bit of a new part for him, which is Phil is really focused the majority of the time I've known him. The second part of the equation, as I call it, how do I protect the data? And he's come up with multiple great solutions for very large organizations on how to protect data. Eric has been all about information management governance. If you don't know what data you have, where that data exists, then how can you even go talk to Phil? The two guys basically have married one another over the past year, which I'm so excited about. And they can now jointly tell this story. And Louis telling the story holistically as well, of course. So we're great about that. But Eric, you've been beating this drum for a long time, right? So yeah. Some examples, some stories, because you've got many of them, of kind of like, this is why it's so important to, and we talked about one here, understand what you have. How do you get there? Help people understand, like, what do you do to even begin that process? And then how do you kind of start moving the acceleration through?
Yeah, no, look, I appreciate the being married to Phil comment. I don't know. We'll talk about that later. But, look, when you go through this process, I mean, you look historically how this was approached, Rob. I think you kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier. The traditional approach is to create this massive project out there, leverage an SI perhaps, and go through this thing of looking at all your databases, all your systems out there. But, you think about it, I mean, from a database perspective, that's where a lot of people went to first, because it's a little bit easier, right? We know, again, in our CRM system, we have sensitive content. When you get outside of those systems, it becomes a little bit dodgier, and you have to have somebody go look at the database and kind of look through the tables, look through the columns and say, is this sensitive, is not sensitive? But even the problem's even more exasperated on the unstructured side of the house. I mean, think about it. If you simply have just 1 million documents, which I'm sure almost every organization on this call has, right? And you put them out lay them out on a table in a conference room, how are you going to know what's in there, right? you literally have to pick up every single piece of paper. You got to look at it and say, oh, this is an invoice. Oh, this is a contract, right? And so that's an exhausting process to go through, even more so than on the structured side. So what you really need to be able to do is automate these processes, number one, right? Be able to kind of point and shoot, so to speak, and say, okay, for these sets of databases, these sets of repositories, SharePoint sites, Google Drives, etc., I want to be able to understand what that content is automatically, and then throw it up on a dashboard to say, here's my risk, viewpoint, if so to speak. Where are my hot spots? Where, and essentially just go ahead and start drilling down and attacking the most riskiest parts of the organization first. So what you're doing in essence is creating that data dictionary, right? And so, following on to one of the questions in the chat, is first you have to understand and have that data dictionary, data inventory, whatever you want to call it. But then you need to go through the process and again, leveraging automation and artificial intelligence, as well as regulatory input into the conversation to say, we're keeping this data for these specific purposes, right? And leveraging that knowledge, both going forward from a regulatory perspective to say, here's why we're keeping this, but more importantly, here's how we're using this in organization, and actually down the line controlling access to that information based on that specific purpose and so on, right? So that's the first part. Now, I'll allude a little bit to the bigger problem, which is kind of, again, where my background comes in and Phil's background comes in, is once you have that data inventory, once you have that data, repository and all the things that you're going to keep it and why you're keeping it and so on, what next, right? Are you going to protect it? Are you going to govern it? Are you going to apply policy to that? Are you going to dispose of that information? Are you retaining it for so long, right? So there's all these things downstream that I feel like the market has kind of forgotten about. That, yeah, knowing what you know is good, and that's like the first goal here, but then what's next? What are you going to do with that data? How are you going to use it? And how are you allowing it to be used? And so those are all the things that you have to have the proper controls and processes in place to ensure that that data is being used for the right purpose, that we're keeping it for the right reasons, we're keeping it for how long we're supposed to keeping it, and of course, if it's being used in cloud analytics environments and those type of things, or the crown jewels, that we're protecting it appropriately. And does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. One of the things, Louis, you've also gotten into that kind of plays off of this is, I guess, the topic of audit scope reduction, right? And I'd like to get kind of your perspective on, some ways that you've seen that really come to fruition.
Yeah, that's it. Kind of comes back to this this notion of risk. You're gonna, how do you address a particular given risk, particularly that needs to that you need to have. So the typical ones are like ECB here in Europe, or any audit with regards to SEC or whatever, PCI DSS, this kind of stuff. You're going to have to, you typically have things audited on a regular basis in order to, make sure that the configurations that you've got around this, around these, around systems that are subject to that are actually are actually adhered to, and that you keep making sure that you're compliant over time. And these are things that, from a product perspective, there's not much we can actually bring as a vendor and on the actual audit process. But where it gets interesting, and this is where we have a history, and amongst us four, Phil, you're the guy with a real history in this space, is what we've done in the past with payments and PCI scope reduction. And I was talking about the retailer earlier on, and how they accidentally came into additional value with the whole marketing operation. But it turns out that by basically encrypting their customer data and actually rolling out that encryption as well to their credit arm, the internal credit arm of that retail organization, which is technically a banking institution, albeit a small one, but it's still a banking institution, and therefore has to go through a particular set of audits by the European Central Bank annually. It turns out that because they didn't have any consumption data, any credit data in some of those analytics systems that they had, it pulled out 2 or 3 applications from their audit scope. And it wasn't something that they actually looked for. But when the auditor came in and said, oh, actually, I don't need to audit that. I don't care because it's only encrypted data now, right? It's no longer applicable. And, just based on those audit fees that they avoided that year, that pretty much paid a solid part of the encryption project for the entire company. So it's just one of those things. It's sometimes you go looking for audit scope reduction because there's big ROI to actually go get, but sometimes you get there by surprise, but the benefits are just as nice.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that takes us also into kind of continuing that down a bit deeper is just the whole topic of data minimization in general. Phil, Eric, thoughts on, anything that you've seen in that particular area that plays another role and some examples maybe that you could share. It'd be great to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in here. So yeah, data minimization is a really big topic, right? If you think about it, data minimization is the ultimate form of protection, right? I mean, you can't breach what isn't there. And, I was working with a healthcare organization out on the West Coast in the upper Pacific Northwest, and they had been breached. And so, when they came to us, they talked to and said, look, we realized we had 20 some odd years of claims data in this database that was breached. So now our scope that we had to go out and do all these things regulatory wise, reaching out to those customers, offering incentives to those customers, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They begin asking themselves, why is there 20 years of data here when reality is, yeah, we need to keep it somewhere or in some fashion, in some way, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in our primary systems because it just doesn't make sense, right? And so they begin implementing policies of saying, hey, here's data that, for example, these claims data, we really only need to keep them 6 months really after the claim's been closed, but let's keep them for 2 years. And then after that, anything older than 2 years, we're going to basically either keep or move or highly protect this information in very interior systems so that if we need to get to them, we can. Or in some cases, if the claim can be deleted defensively and disposed of, we'll do that as well. But essentially segmenting off that data, which kind of leads back a little bit, and I'll cover off on one of the questions in the chat, which is around classification. And so, essentially the question is around, what do you mean by classifications? What are you expecting tools to understand PII versus non-PII and so forth? So really what I see out there is that when you're doing this analysis, you need to understand, certainly there are various regulatory bodies that may govern you. It may be GDPR, it may be KVKK, it may be PIPEDA in Canada, it might be CCPA, CPRA here in the US, right? That's great if you're under one of those things. It gives you guidelines for what needs to be understood and what's not. And then of course, but even organizations themselves may go beyond that, because I worked with a brand, also a retail brand, that sells very intimate material. So privacy is actually a very big part of their lives in general. So they told me specifically, they said, look, Eric, we don't want to be chasing every regulation that comes along, especially when the US alone has multiple states implementing different policies now. So we want to put in data privacy umbrella and then map to that. So essentially to answer the question, you need to understand what's PII and not PII. We can do that through things like what we call grammars. In other words, here's the things we need to look for, and the reason we typically keep them and what they typically look like. And then also beyond that, we can allow organizations to say, well, that's great, but I also want to know understand what's valuable, what's not valuable. I also want to, we need to manage ITAR data here in the US, which is essentially a regulation that keeps us from shipping out certain pieces of equipment to certain countries. So, those are things that are above and beyond data privacy that we still might need to classify and understand. And then that classification drives the retention schedules and the defensible deletion, and essentially that whole back-end life cycle of the data. So it all starts with discovery. It goes through classification, and then that classification determines how we're going to move, govern, and protect that data, whether it's through encryption technology and tokenization technology, or through a lifecycle management process or governance process or a disposable process. So hope that answers the question.
I think it answers the question, and it takes us right through an understanding of, you know, the value, right, in that approach for many organizations. But again, it's multiple use cases. And Phil mentioned right at the very onset the example of creating kind of the center of excellence, right, which is holistic, right, and being able to service multiple needs from a technology perspective that we discussed, whether it's the data analytics aspects, whether it's how we protect the data, but just having the models where the business can come back to them with the ask, and then they can come back with being able to provide the service capability that they put in place. So I think that's very helpful. We're getting close to the top of the hour here and wrapping things up. So I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. I know we've been answering some of them along the way, which is great. But let's go ahead and actually transition to the questions at this point in time, so we can kind of get those kicked off and make sure we have enough time. So this is going to go around the horn for you guys. I will start with you, Phil, on this, and this is a great question that came in. So everyone take out the crystal ball here, because this is a 5-year view, okay? So where do you guys see the future of data security within the next 5 years? 3 years is fine, guys. Do you think all should be moved to cloud solutions and have nothing on-prem? So I'll go right through Phil, Eric, and then Louis.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I can't see that happening fully within that time span. And it does come back to an earlier question. I've seen it drop off the list now. It's to do with my comment earlier about the dangers of misconfiguration. So I'll come back to this. Well, the question was about responsibility, and it clearly is a shared responsibility with the cloud vendors and the organization themselves. But let's try and minimize at least most dangerous types of data, right? And we get asked this all the time in terms of, where should I protect that data before I even move it to the cloud? If I can't remove it, as Eric has suggested, right? Let's at least persistently protect it on premises before it goes to a more dangerous environment, whether that's a cloud or maybe it's an aggregated data warehouse environment. But we're always advocating protect that data as soon as possible, especially those identifying attributes. Now, quasi-identifying attributes, well, that's still to be discussed, right? But there's still a huge amount of risk that we can reduce by protecting those data elements very early in their life cycle. But again, we have to understand where they are and what they are. So we can, recognizing that, I think will help in the long term, right? And I think we talked about it a little bit earlier. We've learned these lessons from the PCI world. There's no reason why we cannot apply those to national identifiers, membership identifiers, social security numbers, social insurance numbers, right? Those are not required for general day-to-day analytics, that's for certain, right? And even business applications, the common question we hear or comment we hear is, the business users have always had this data. Yeah. Well, there's no, and the question was purpose, right? Well, there's no purpose for them to have those risky elements any longer, right? Let's get them out of the system. If we can't remove them completely, at least permanently tokenize them, pseudonymize them. That's a big step in the right direction.
Yeah. Eric?
Yeah, I kind of agree with Phil, and just really 2 quick points, right? So again, first of all, I just can't see people going lock, stock, and barrel and throwing that stuff up into the cloud in the next couple of years. Obviously, there'll be a migration over time, but I don't think it'll be very few examples of complete cloud infrastructures. The other part, Phil's talked about this a couple times, is that the various cloud vendors, until you can get a common protection mentality in place and it's widespread, you would be leveraging different cloud vendors and hybrid environments and lots of different solutions until there's something really elegant in place that we can do and everybody's adopting it. I can't see clients really going that direction. Not to say that it doesn't exist, but making sure that everybody's actually putting those controls in place.
Yeah, I think it's the if you look at it, right, who can actually be cloud only now or in 5 years? Well, it's really a startup, right? I mean, these smaller organizations, okay, they're going to spin up that way. That's the way they've got it. These larger organizations are not going to get there that easily, right? They're making their moves now, which is great. And a lot of things that every one of you guys have been talking about is truly being able to put the capability in place that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which cloud or multiple cloud solutions and vendors that they want to work with. The capability to support them is going to be there. So I think
and remember, a lot of these firms are still on mainframes too. So
that's a good point.
That's a big leap.
How many times has the mainframe been destined for retirement?
Decommissioning the mainframe every year, right? Right. Louis, what are your thoughts?
Looking into the crystal ball, if you look at things holistically from a security standpoint, what's the CISO's role? His job is to maintain the availability, the confidentiality, and integrity of his system, right? High level helicopter view, right? From an availability standpoint, the cloud for many is a no-brainer, right? So there is going to be a trend of putting stuff into the cloud, but where from the for sure. But where it all comes what it all really comes down to is, do we on the integrity part, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem, these are similar questions that you have to ask yourselves, and the role of the CISO is going to change. It's going to be a little different, but they're still going to have the same amount of work to do. The really hard part is that confidentiality piece, and from this side of the ocean compared to you three, clearly the notion of confidentiality is a big thing, right? And for many, it's what's going to be holding people back from actually making that jump. And also, the question is, does in terms of cloud security, when you want to have confidentiality, can you have do you know what you're sending there? What do you need to secure before it actually goes there? That's one. The whole question of what's that risk of that confidentiality going out the window, and then what are the additional measures that I put in to protect the data that I do send there, and so the name of the game for many organizations, I think, and it's going to be true. It's true now. It's going to be true in 3 years. It's still going to be true in 5 years, because there's just the task of actually getting to know what the data and actually taking the time to actually protect it. Each of these two tasks, which are essential, take so long for larger organizations that it's still going to be an ongoing process in the next 3 to 5 years. And what they're going to be looking for is for technology that provides this, like Eric was mentioning, this persistent protection across the multiple cloud vendors. Because what we're going to see most probably is that the business relationships that companies will have may actually evolve and grow and deteriorate and change. This is the day-to-day business world, right? Things change. That's the one constant. It's and taxes. The thing is, the odds, what the CISO is going to want to look for is a capability to protect, and a process with which the CISO can protect data wherever it goes, whether it's on-prem or whichever cloud vendor it is, whichever analytics platform it is. It's about this agnosticity. It's how do they get the process right, and how do they tool that process right of migrating to the cloud. That's what's going to hold them back. Once they've figured that one out, there's still the integrity component. There are some things that they'll want to keep on-prem as opposed to outsource. Nothing's ever going to be 100% for a full cloud, I don't think. But a lot of it's going to go that way, particularly when they figured out that equation and figured out that they can call us, hey, I'm shameless.
That's a shameless plug there, Louis. Yes, it is. Okay. Thank you guys for the answer and looking in the crystal ball. There's several other questions there, but we're running a little tight on time. And actually, a couple of them that I'm seeing, I think we've already answered throughout the conversation around the data discovery way of helping data deletion and as well as, can we actually do data discovery within databases? The short answer is yes. So anything that's still pending for questions, we'll be able to follow up with everyone directly on their questions and provide responses. Wanted to bring up one final note to emphasize here with everyone, which is, as we continue moving forward on these discussions, you'll be seeing a recently commissioned research that we conducted in conjunction with the Osterman Research Group. It's regarding basically the progress that we've been seeing made, and they've been pulling this data together around privacy and compliance in general. And so it'll be great to get perspectives and understand kind of what they've found out there. So keep an eye out for that upcoming webcast and report here in the near future. One of the main emphases that you'll see called out, though, will be focusing on that next conversation in that research report relative to the customer trust. And if you recall, everyone sprinkled in an element of impact for organizations in dealing with their customers, and the trust factor was part of that. So we'll delve deeply into that as part of the research findings and the session on that. So that's it for today. We truly appreciate you spending the time. We know you have many things going on in your schedules, and spending time with us today is great to have these conversations, share more about what we're doing, what we're seeing with other organizations, helping solve problems similar probably what you're dealing with. And then the questions and engagement was also very helpful. So again, be aware that this is going to continue on as a series of sessions. We'll have more conversations on these topics, continue to delve into them. And as a reminder, today's session is going to be available as a replay, so you can go ahead and listen to it again or share it out with others as well. So this concludes our event. Have a great day, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks.